In this week's episode of Erased, after experiencing the phenomenon of revival, Satoru Fujinuma has traveled back in time to the distant year of 1988, where he gets to see his old classmates and reminisce about the old days of Nintendo hanging out with friends and looking out for vicious killers. Oh, this series is so phenomenally atmospheric and I absolutely love every single second of it. I just love the premise of this series, of that someone going back in time, keeping their current thoughts and memories, and being able to relive these events so that they can change something entirely. This episode right here was strangely nostalgic as well, as we got to experience Satoru's environment as he remembers it, and yet it's still all a little fuzzy to him. This episode was basically an excuse to introduce all of the main characters of the series, all of Satoru's friends. Not to mention, we are formally introduced to Kayo Hinazuki, who is a girl who was seemingly killed, but now Satoru finally has the chance to prevent that from happening. This episode also had some very heavy imagery and lots of really great emotional moments, such as the scene where Satoru panics, leaves school, and desperately runs back to his home to find that his mother is indeed still alive during this time period. In fact, he's even more affectionate and loving with her now, which is definitely a big surprise to his mother. Something about that scene of just them having dinner and enjoying each other's company just really warms my heart. Another thing that I really love about this episode is that they do a really good job of letting you know that this is 1988. They drop names like the Famicom, the original Nintendo, Dragon Quest III, which also came out in 1988, not to mention Final Fantasy. They really want you to remind you that this is the late 80s. The big thing about this episode, however, is that Satoru has now realized that he has traveled back in time and he has a new opportunity to save his friends as well as Kayo Hinazuki. At first, all of Satoru's friends believe that he's actually in love with Kayo Hinazuki, and they do everything in their power to try and hook him up. And this leads to a lot of very awkward scenes, because you gotta realize, this is a 29-year-old in an 11-year-old's body talking to an 11-year-old girl. There's something just so sweet and hilarious at the end when they touch hands that makes him so nervous that he thinks he should be able to control his emotions, because he's a 29-year-old. But by being brought back to the 80s, all of these memories have officially flushed back into him, and he's feeling it all over again. The big difference this time, of course, is that he's trying to help out Kayo, who is a very deeply disturbed individual, and that's because apparently she has a very rough family life. It's heavily implied that she's beaten viciously by her mother in this episode. You see evidence of this through flashbacks, and of course, that she has bruises all over her body, and that she always hangs out at the park, even on the most cold, snowy nights, just so that she doesn't have to go home. This is, of course, where this killer found her and decided to take advantage of her greatest weakness. Not only that, but she seems to just want to get away from everyone. There's this sequence where they're reading these class stories where she says that she wants to live on an island by herself, away from everyone, her family, her classmates. She just wants to do everything herself. She doesn't want to be in that cold, dark environment anymore. This scene is incredibly important because not only does it make you sympathize with the character of Kayo, but it also makes you realize that she's incredibly similar to Satoru himself. Despite the fact that Satoru has a lot of smiles and seems like he has a lot of friends, he's putting on something of a front for them, but his philosophy on all of this is what he learned from his friend, the implied killer of the series, who was definitely framed by this real killer. And I can't wait to see how these elements are going to sort of pop up as the series goes on. That final shot of the episode in particular was absolutely disturbing. The shot of the killer waiting outside of her house, the bloody gloves on the ground, it's just so incredibly ominous. This is going to be one of those series that I frankly just cannot wait to see how they're going to wrap up everything, and I really do fear for the life of Satoru's friends at this point, now that we're finally starting to get to know them a little bit. They're all ridiculous, they all have their own special personalities, the geek, the weirdo, the genius, and they all happen to love things that all kids love, which is just hanging out, having fun, and playing Nintendo. And because of that, they seem that much more vulnerable to the killer, which is eventually going to pop up in the series. Another thing that I really love about this episode is all of the stylistic and artistic choices that they're making with the series. Whenever they're in the full flashback sequences of Satoru reliving his childhood, it's in this widescreen format. And occasionally you'll actually get to hear the older voice of Satoru as well, sort of being his inner monologue, which I had to admit was very strange at first, but it actually does make sense. He still has the same mindset that he had when he was 29 years old. So what's the rundown on this week's episode of Erased? This was just another atmospheric and very nostalgic episode. Despite the fact that we still know very little about the character of Satoru and what happened in his past, you really sort of get that old school feeling of hanging out with your friends at school and after school in this week's episode. You get to see a lot of that through the brand new intro of the show, which is Riri, which is done by the classic Japanese band Asian Kung Fu Generation. It's a very nice intro. I don't know if it's the greatest intro I've ever seen, but it does a serviceable job of getting you excited for the show. The ending is also equally beautiful, but the best thing about this episode, without a doubt, is just the nostalgia. The warm, happy feelings I got from this episode, and the impending doom which is eventually going to be coming in the series. Already, events are changing big time. Just the fact that he's interacting with his classmates in a completely different way, he doesn't remember where his class seat was, him finally actually talking to Kaio for the first time. He might actually be able to bring her out of her shell to a point where she might not even have to interact with that killer whatsoever, although it's only a matter of time before we run into this character, and it's undoubtedly going to be a really intense experience. Another thing that's really great about this episode, and something that I learned last week, is that this is indeed based on a manga series, but it's a manga series which actually had a complete ending, which means we're actually going to get to see the entire story told in anime form, and I think that is freaking-tastic, because I don't want to read the manga version. I want to be able to experience this in anime form from beginning to end, and I have a feeling that this one is just going to rock me right in the feels. The biggest thing about this episode, without a doubt, though, is that we get to see that events from the past are already changing drastically. Apparently, when he runs into Kaio at the very end of the episode, this was the very last time that he actually saw this character, but by actually interacting with her and trying to become her friend, events are already changing. It doesn't seem like she's going to be killed. And if she is seemingly killed, does this mean that Revival is going to kick back into motion? Are we going to go back in time yet again? Maybe even further back? Maybe even forward? There's just so many possibilities for this amazingly well-written and atmospheric anime series, which also happens to have some very good production value. I actually felt cold watching this episode just because of the way they actually drew the backgrounds and all of the snowy streets. It really does feel like a really great winter anime, which is eventually going to go into spring. Just the atmosphere alone of the show is a reason to check this one out. I will say that this is definitely the type of show that I usually don't watch, and I want to thank you guys again for getting me into it, because now I'm really looking forward to every single episode and to see how things are going to change. There's something so incredibly genius and phenomenal about a story of going back in time and changing the events. Of course, we've had time travel stories before. Just look at Back to the Future. But something about this one is just really gripping and just heartwarming and dangerous all at the same time. This is a series which is going to have the ability to draw out a lot of different emotions from its viewers, and I can't wait to experience this show with you guys as it goes on. What I will say is I really loved this episode quite a bit. I'm finally going to start giving scores to the episodes. I thought this was a really great introduction to 1988, Satoru and his friends, and seeing what his life is like as he prepares to change these tumultuous events from 1988. So I'm going to give this episode right here a 5 out of 5. Check it out, Erased fans. It was another fantastic episode. If you did watch this week's episode of the series, make sure to tell me what you thought about it in the comment section below. Did you enjoy this week's story? What do you want to see from the rest of this anime series? Please tell me in the comment section below. Thank you guys for watching this review. Make sure to like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys again for watching, and as always, stay dandy, baby!